Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore, and we're continuing our discussion with Maryland Working Families, which is an organization in Maryland made up of different groups that all have a progressive political agenda and are trying to make various kinds of policy changes. And we've been discussing and debating the relationship of Maryland Working Families to the Democratic Party and what's going on in the Democratic Party. Joining me at the table again, first of all, is Mark McLaurin. He's the political director for SEIU Local 500. Also, Charlie Carter, she's Executive Director of Maryland Working Families. Rebecca Mark is the Baltimore organizer, and Dante Bishop is the Policy Director for Maryland Working Families. Thank you all for joining us again. So, Charlie, at the end, I said, at the end of the last segment, and to give you a chance to answer, that it was the policies of Barack Obama, but the continuation of the Clinton policies, and frankly, a continuation of Republican policies, but you could call them perhaps exploitation light versus exploitation super heavy between the Democrats and some of the Republicans. But all that being said, the wealth disparity during the Obama years became the greatest gap in the history of the country. We know that the recovery in incomes after the 07-08 crisis, something like the top 1% received 90% of the income gain after the crisis. And certainly that had a lot to do, not the only factor, but a lot to do with the election of Donald Trump, the fact that so much of the working class and poor, their life simply didn't get better, and for many it got worse during the Obama years. That's not to say it's going to get any better under the Trump years. It's clearly a con. But that being said, if life had gotten better for people, especially in those sections of the working class, I don't think Trump would have won. What do you make of that?
I think it's easy to lay all the blame on the at the feet of President Obama. But let's also
I didn't say that.
Remember.
I said as a set of policies that go back far beyond him.
Yeah.
But he happened to be president at a time when the crisis was used to make even a bigger income gap and even more intense transferring of wealth from working people to the wealthy.
I think also that we can say that a lot of the policies that President Obama pushed also got stalled in the Republican Congress. I think, after healthcare, that the change, the wide swing from a democratically controlled Congress to a Republican controlled Congress, whose stated intent was to make sure that Barack Obama was the one.
Why did they lose that vote?
Well, I think.
Why did they lose control?
I think there's a lot that you can unpack there. Some of it has to do with history. That when you have a president in the next cycle, the Congress tends to switch to the other party. I think that that's a contributing factor. But I also think that and let's not forget that the financial crisis was not a creation of Barack Obama. It happened under George Bush, who got out just at the tail end, and it was Barack Obama who at least passed some policies that kept people working, and allowed people to at least hang on to what little they still had that wasn't wiped out by Wall Street. I think, if anything, what we should be looking at is these policies that have driven an overemphasis on the success of Wall Street, and these with the ideology that everybody would benefit if Wall Street benefited. And I think that one of the things Working Families pushes back on is the idea that if corporations benefit, everybody benefits.
And that's taking place on the fight, for example, Port Covington development, where there's a lot of tax breaks being given to the owner of Under Armour and others. And it's not the only one.
I think
the general policy's been here.
It's the Fight for 15, it's earned sick leave, it's fair scheduling. I think any of those things where we are fighting for policies that will create economic stability for working families, that there's a trade-off. And the Greater Baltimore Committee would come in, or the Chamber of Commerce would come in and say, any change that you made to increase economic stability for families would be the death knell, to use Mark's words, for business. And for too long, our leaders, including Democrats, many Democrats, have followed along with that ideology that people's pensions were invested in Wall Street and people's 401ks were invested in Wall Street, when the reality is very few Americans have pensions now, and very few Americans have 401ks now. And so most people are living paycheck to paycheck. And when you have policies that destabilize those paychecks, that is really what's at fault. That, I think, is what Bernie Sanders tapped into. I think that, to her, that's the missing cue that Senator Hillary Clinton missed, is that most people, we live in a completely different world now. Here in Maryland, we're trying to raise the minimum wage. Working families led the fight to raise the minimum wage in 2014, and we successfully did that to $10.10. But even then, we knew that $10.10 was not enough. Right now, we know $15 isn't enough, but it will get families farther than they ever could if we just left it.
Dante, one of the, it seems to me, the underlying ideological, political division in the Democratic Party, the Sanders-Clinton forces, although I don't even think Sanders espouses what I'm about to say clearly enough, is whether everything is going to be done through the private sector or there's actually going to be a build-out of policies of strengthening the public sector. Like when Barack Obama had his employment program, I think it was a $750 billion stimulus package, he promised everything was going to go through the private sector, outside of the funding of state and local governments that would keep teachers and policemen and such hired. But the idea of a Roosevelt-style direct federal work program, the idea of direct investment publicly in developing public services, infrastructure spending through the public sector, that's been the Baltimore model. Everything's private. It's all about the downtown inner harbor. It's all if you give tax deductions and giveaways, and it's all about attracting outside private investment. Well, 60 years of that policy has given chronic poverty in Baltimore, more unemployment. Doesn't that have to be challenged, both within the Democratic Party and generally in the public, that there has to be some public alternatives to this, because that public-private partnership always turns out shoveling public money into private hands, private pockets?
Yeah, I think it is definitely incumbent on our leaders to be intentional about their investment in ourselves. Like, we need to invest in ourselves. That includes infrastructure, social services, as you say. And as we said earlier, we of course want businesses to flourish, but we also desperately want progress on an enhanced modernization of our workplace standards, because people should be able to work with dignity. And so what we say often is, for American workers, a good job has just a few key defining characteristics, a fair salary, safe work environment, healthcare benefits, and the ability to take time off without risk of losing your job.
My question is, and any of you can pick it up, is that the underlying philosophy is that you cannot talk about doing stuff through the public sector because, oh my God, it sounds like socialism. Right. So the right hates it. But like, for example, a public enterprise that would renovate houses and hire local people to learn skills and reclaim housing to be low-income housing. And it also raises the issue of raising more revenue. The issue of an estate tax, the issue of they used to have a millionaire's tax in Maryland.
Right.
So both on the revenue side and building out the public sector side, because so far this sort of dichotomy, yes, we want business to do well, but really you should be nicer on these sorts of things. It's reasonable. It just it's not getting anywhere.
Well, I think one of the things that people forget is that the middle class in this country was built on public sector employment. And
especially Baltimore.
Baltimore.
To a large extent, Baltimore.
I think much of Maryland. I mean, one of the reasons that Maryland can claim itself as the wealthiest state in the nation is because we have so many public employees who live in this state, and most of those employees have unions. They have stability. They have pensions. They have good paying jobs. But there has been a push to privatize all of those, and there are many, people will say there are a lot of factors that contribute to the thought that you want to privatize that and create private wealth. But I think that we have to look at public solutions to solve some of these problems and not just push it off to the private sector. There's one thing that we can always say is that when you look at the founding, the core organizational documents for a corporation, it is to make a profit. It is not to improve the lives of citizens. It is not to improve the lives of a workforce. It is not even necessarily to create a better community or a better economy for the city in which they're founded. It is for that corporation to make a profit for its shareholders.
And one of the things that apparently is not seen as short-term profitable enough, because there's almost zero effort going into it in Maryland and many other places, and Baltimore, is confronting the issue of climate change. Like, if there isn't public policy driving this and public sector driving it, there's not going to be, especially given that we have a climate change denier as president right now, and an administration that's actually undoing what I would say is way too modest measures that were done under the Obama administration, but at least it was something. That's being undone. Rebecca, this issue of climate change is an existential threat and barely gets talked about.
Well, I think the question is talked about with who and with what language. While climate change is obviously an issue, one of the ways that we can address it while actually addressing the needs of the people, since it is such an existential thing, while addressing the needs of the people right now, day to day, is framing it in terms of environmental justice and looking at it within the context of history, of our history of racial segregation, of our history of prioritizing certain communities over others, of prioritizing also companies over the interests of people. When you break it down on a way that impacts people's lives, if you bring up that Baltimore has one of the I think maybe the highest air pollution death rates in the country, and that's not in Roland Park, that's in that's downtown, that's by the incinerator. When we frame it in terms of that, then we look at what can we do to make our lives better, what can we do to make our children's lives better. Then that kind of addresses all those issues at once. You see it together, and then kind of getting back to if I could jump into what you're saying with the development in Port Covington and everything.
I mean, what I'm getting at is if you're really going to do something at the local or state level, and right now it's going to have to be at local and state levels, because at the federal level, climate change policy is dead. I don't see how it gets done without the public sector way more involved.
Absolutely.
And not in partnership with the private sector, because the private sector, with some exceptions, it's not where they want to put their money.
So if I may on that, one of the things Maryland Working Families has been a part of the helping mobilize, getting people to go out to the People's Climate March in April. We are in a coalition with different environmental justice groups in Maryland and in Baltimore, the Baltimore People's Climate Movement. We also helped through the Maryland Environmental Health Network, I have to definitely plug them, helped a youth-led group, Baltimore Beyond Plastic, pass a resolution in City Hall that signed Baltimore onto the Paris Climate Agreement, but then went farther, making sure that we will do more to address climate change and that it will be done equitably. It's where Maryland Working Families kind of comes in with that is when there is a new, with these new industries that are being invested in, whether or not, not as much as maybe they should be, but they are these new industries, and we want to make sure that we don't fall down the same holes as histories of mining or anything, that the jobs that go in, it's carved into it. If we're talking about improving the future for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren, like they always say about climate change, let's make sure that these jobs in the renewable energy markets are actually have economic stability and treat people with dignity and have a quality of life for them.
I mean, you've got a port in Maryland, just outside of Baltimore, which is one of the main ports exporting coal.
I think the larger point that you were making, which was around kind of this kind of derogation of the public sector, and not, like that somehow investment in the public sector is somehow seen as something that is kind of less than preferable, or something that should exist below investment in the private sector. And that has been a recurring problem, even in a state like Maryland. I mean, all you have to do is visit Annapolis one time to be reminded that Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, that state legislature can, in many respects, is one of the more anti-democratic institutions and one of the more Southern-feeling institutions that I've ever been to. I mean, Annapolis and Richmond, are about the same, in terms of working there, if you've ever worked in both of them. And so, one of the things that we did at SEIU, and that we're continuing to do with working families, is we've got to change who is in Annapolis representing us. Okay, and so what we did in 2010 was we took out 5 incumbent Democratic senators, and we replaced them with who? With public employees. Okay, so. And George Della was defeated here in Baltimore City by Bill Ferguson, was a Baltimore City school teacher. Nat Exum in Prince George's County was defeated by Joanne Benson, a high school principal. So we have looked to our membership. We're continuing that work in 2018. We're targeting Democratic incumbents in District 44 and in District 45 and a whole host of districts. But our preferred candidates are candidates that come out of the public sector. They have a unique reverence for and respect for and belief in, most importantly, its ability to do the most good. Because Maryland is supposed to be a citizen legislature. So most of the folks there for 90 days have other jobs, and far too few of those other jobs are public sector employees. Far too many of them come out of the small business community that is, that is philosophically hostile to public sector investment. So the work that Working Families is doing is changing that very thing that you pointed to as a problem, which is, a degrading of the public sector.
And we've seen a sea change. From 2014 to 2010 to 2014, we saw a huge change in the legislature, where a number of, I would say, 20 new progressive legislators were elected, Corey McCray among those. And we've seen the work that he's done. In his very first year, he restored voting rights to ex-felons here in the state, and has continued to do good work putting money into training programs for youth and not internships, allowing people to get trained in trades. Apprenticeships. Thank you. I think Mark is right, is that, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the city level, where we helped usher in, 5 new progressive leaders, where they formed the very core of the Progressive Caucus here in Baltimore, that we're, by electing progressives and challenging, Democrats who have for too long, prioritized the success of business over people.
Let's get concrete about that.
Yeah.
There's going to be a Democratic primary for governor.
Yes.
Bernie Sanders came and endorsed Ben Jealous.
Yes.
Are you guys going to endorse somebody for governor?
We will make an endorsement in the Democratic primary. My guess is sometime early fall.
Is it going to be Ben Jealous?
We haven't. We're still going through the process where we're soliciting questionnaires, and we'll have interviews with the candidates, and then
the same fight's going to take place. It's going to be the Sanders versus Clinton wing, in all likelihood.
Well, I think that we have a good field of candidates right now, and for that, we think it's important that there's a good field of candidates, that they're raising issues about working families. Whether it's Ben Jealous, whether it's Rich Madaleno, whether it's Kevin Kamenetz, we want to hear people talking about the issues that have been avoided so long. And we're happy that there's going to be a healthy debate. We're hoping there's a healthy debate, and that there's not, an attempt to squash debate and only, get in line behind one person. We want there to continue to be every candidate talking about issues like $15 an hour minimum wage, you know, having people be able to predict their schedules so that they can get a second job or go to school for more training, or even to go to your question about investment in public strategies that can not only help address things like climate change, but also repair our infrastructure and put people to work at the same time. You know, Working Families is pushing, we believe in holistic solutions to problems, whether that, and it's why we react so vehemently to when things like Port Covington come up. To go back to your previous question about climate change, you know, this is an instance where a city that claims itself to be poor, where we've had 60 years, as you said, of increasingly concentrated poverty in areas of the city which have never seen an ounce of investment, that city leaders could, with a straight face, say that they're going to invest $600 million or more into an area which has absolutely no infrastructure, which will be underwater in 10 years. Yeah. That you know, we see as an alternative investing $600 million in Sandtown, in Cherry Hill, in Oliver, to rebuild the infrastructure there and to put people to work at the same time. So we think that what we desperately need and have not had are leaders with hope and vision. And I think, you know, you've talked a lot about Bernie Sanders. I think what really drew people to Bernie Sanders, just like Barack Obama, is they presented a vision for people, a vision that people could buy into, that things can get better. And I think here in Baltimore and in Maryland, people want to work hard. People do work hard, but we want to go in a direction. People need to be led by leaders that have a vision for how their lives will improve.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.